Hello. After nearly 40 years and recently 10 editions, 40k has proven to be one of the most iconic, popular, and genuinely important tabletop games ever made. A science fiction fantasy war game set against the backdrop of an interstellar imperium that is as grim and as dark as it gets, the game has changed substantially over the years, but it's remarkable just how much we would recognise in modern 40k from the very original edition of the game that was published way back when. Much of this wildly inventive and innovatively wonderful game was conceived by writer Rick Priestley, but it took many hands and a company's worth of talent to turn it into the juggernaut it would become. And we are going to explore all of it. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today, here is the making of Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader. In 1987, the 40k universe was born with the publication of Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, the first edition of a game that would go on to utterly change the company that published it. And not just that, it would rewrite the rules of the entire industry and the hobby of wargaming. Rogue Trader was the name of the very first edition of 40k, released as a science fiction counterpart to Warhammer Fantasy. It allowed players to field armies of spacefaring marines, orcs, elves, and dwarves in a far distant future, where mankind is united in a grim imperium managed by infinite bureaucracy and ruled by a corpse emperor kept alive only by the powers of his golden throne and the daily sacrifice of thousands of his psychic subjects. This was a dark universe that knew only war, where battles were brutal and death was an absolute certainty, and people loved it. The history of Rogue Trader is intrinsically linked with the careers of two individuals. Its author, Rick Priestley, who had been working on the game since before he came to work at Citadel and then later Games Workshop, and Brian Ansell, the man who co-founded Citadel and would later own Games Workshop. So, to understand the history of 40k, we'll have to at least touch on the history of Priestley, Ansell, and Games Workshop itself. But that is a complicated set of topics, and I've already explored some of it in my History of Warhammer Fantasy, which you can watch right here if you want more detail. But for us, for now, we are about to take our first steps into the 41st millennium. So before we don our power armor and grab our lasguns, why don't you give this video a like if you like it and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. Of the many incredibly talented folks and unexpected turns that led to the creation of 40k, probably a good place to start the story is with the closest thing we've got to an emperor, a genuine visionary who changed the course of wargaming history when he commissioned Warhammer, a man called Brian Ansell. Ansell co-founded a miniatures company called Asgard and wrote a number of zines and games rules over the years, forever pushing the limits of miniature manufacturing technology and envisioning a bold new future for the entire industry. Ansell would, in time, pitch the owners of Games Workshop on a plan to create a brand new company, which would later become so powerful a driving force that it would essentially take over the entire organization. In 1980, Ansell wrote a science fiction war game designed for use with 15mm miniatures called Laserburn. Working with Richard Halliwell, better known as Hal, Ansell produced a follow-up to Laserburn called Imperial Commander in 1981, which expanded on the world of that original game. Ideas and concepts from both Laserburn and Imperial Commander would stay with Ansell and would ultimately find their way into the Rogue Trader game that would be created the better part of a decade later. These included the Imperium of Man, power armor, dreadnought armor, jet bikes, and bolt guns. But before Laserburn had even been created, there had already been a step on the journey towards 40k, when young school friends Rick Priestley and Hal, the person who had collaborated with Ansell on Imperial Commander, had been creating their own games as well. Their self-published title was called Combat 3000. It was a science fiction skirmish game inspired by the sci-fi movies, television, and books that were permeating pop culture in the late 70s. Star Wars, Blake 7, Doctor Who, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, all of that had filtered into the creation of the game, and inside its pages, you would find the promise that you could command a squad of Star Troopers, blast your way into the galaxy's richest banks, and out of the strongest and most famous jails, boldly go where no man had probably gone before, swap insults with exotic aliens, then swap blows with insulted aliens. But it wasn't Combat 3000 that was the most important early step. In fact, they secured work at Citadel based on a game that they'd created before Combat 3000, called Reaper. Published in 1978, Reaper was a fantasy wargame that Hal and Priestley had developed from their own games at home and at school, and it was only thanks to Brian Ansell, then working at Asgard, that they had been put in contact with the people who could illustrate and finally publish it. Ansell saw enough in the work of this pair of young games designers that he would soon recruit them both into the company that he was co-founding with Sir Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson. Citadel would be a new miniature manufacturer that would sell exclusively through the retail company Games Workshop. Over the next couple of years, there would be an enormous amount of amazing success for Citadel, the creation of new fantasy ranges and some sci-fi ones as well, that would push the envelope of miniature manufacturing and would create an enormous amount of profit for Games Workshop. Things couldn't go better, with the exception of the several times that Brian Ansell quit, because there was some friction in Games Workshop. There was a tension between the London-based central offices that were driving the retail company and the Nottingham-based Citadel Miniatures company. And because of that friction, Ansell walked away. It was seeming unlikely that there would be a future for Citadel, for Warhammer, and that Warhammer 40,000 would never exist. The only way it would be possible is if, by some miraculous stroke of luck, Brian Ansell ended up in charge of Games Workshop. In 1985, Brian Ansell took over Games Workshop from founders Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, becoming the managing director. For the next 6 years, the company would evolve according to his design, with Citadel becoming the engine room and Warhammer the fuel. The first edition of Warhammer Fantasy had been written by Rick Priestley and Hal, and released in 1983. It was a project that Ansell had initiated as a way to get role players to buy more Citadel minis. After all, selling a handful of miniatures to a dungeon master for a dungeon crawl is one thing, but being able to sell them a battlefield of miniatures that can all be used at the same time is an entirely different and far more profitable opportunity. Warhammer was instantly successful, and Citadel continued to produce new models and rules in their irregular magazines, like the Citadel Compendium and the Citadel Journal. These publications advertised new miniatures and also provided new ideas and new ways to play. One such article was included in the very first Citadel Compendium, released in '83. It was written by Rick Priestley, and it offered new rules for playing science fiction games and using futuristic weapons in your games of Warhammer Fantasy. It has become a convention amongst gamers that science fiction games and fantasy games are somehow distinct and mutually exclusive. An odd situation that in a hobby which promotes the imagination, an irrational and avoidable barrier should exist. I have seen and participated in games in which the two genres have been mixed, and these have worked exceptionally well, keeping the players both amused and confused at the same time. In fact, there would soon be plenty of science fiction in Warhammer Fantasy. As its world was beginning to evolve, the Slann were emerging as a major player, a race of frog-like peoples from space. The Amazons who lived near them in Lustria, well, they were using needlers and lasguns. This was fantasy fi with a sprinkle of sci. In that same first Citadel Compendium, there was also an advert at the back of the magazine for a forthcoming science fiction game called Rogue Trader, one that promised an enigmatic opportunity to encounter Dr. Costello's amazing intergalactic psycho circus. This space-based naval war game was a project that Priestley had been working on even before he came to Citadel. It had even been announced as a coming soon project at the very bottom of the last page of April 1983's Citadel Dragon catalogue. When I spoke with Rick Priestley last year, he told me a little bit about it. And you had sort of previously talked about doing a a spaceships game, and as you say, Brian Ansell was not too keen on the sci-fi world. How did it even come to pass that you were creating a new science fiction skirmish war game?
Well, yeah, the name Rogue Trader comes from a game that I'd written before I joined Games Workshop, which I joined Games Workshop on the understanding that it would be produced. And it was a spaceship raiding trading game that was a bit like Traveller, but it was more focused on the actual ship combat. And I designed a range of spaceships to go with it, which Games Workshop bought off me and incorporated into their science fiction ship range at the time. So that was a different thing. It had the concept of the fantasy races in space. So the bad guys were orcs, the sort of the elder race that had been around for thousands of years and was Eldar, elves in space.
And in a 2011 interview with the Tales of the Maelstrom blog, Rick Priestley went into even more detail. The original Rogue Trader universe was a proto-version of the 40k background, so some of the major spacefaring races were already worked out. Eldar, elves, orcs, orcs, as was the idea of the Imperium as this sprawling medieval realm spread precariously throughout warp space. Hence the Rogue Traders, captains plying the boundaries of space, boldly going in Star Trek style. Some of the background to that game ended up in the back of the final Rogue Trader book, and some was used in Battlefleet Gothic. Immediately after Warhammer had shipped, Rick Priestley had set about working on his science fiction game Rogue Trader, but the unexpected success of Warhammer would quickly forestall further progress. Rather than simply turn around another print run of Warhammer's first edition, Ansell decided to commission a revised second edition. Priestley and Hal were to clean up the game's rules and layout, and begin the primordial steps of developing its setting. Priestley's sci-fi naval game was set aside, because fantasy was just more important. By 1987, a third edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles had been created, one that aimed to be the most comprehensive version of the game yet. It was released not as a box set like those previous editions, but instead as a single mighty tome, stuffed full of crunchy rules and fluffy lore. And around the same time, despite Brian Ansell's mild misgivings about the potential interest in it, Rick Priestley was finally given leave to finish writing his Rogue Trader game. The thing is, after a couple of false starts, and the intervening development of so much Warhammer Fantasy, Rick Priestley found himself taking a different approach to Rogue Trader. It would be inspired not just by the format of the latest Warhammer Fantasy, but mechanically and universally as well. The actual Rogue Trader book was really a development of the Warhammer Fantasy game for sci-fi, and we'd started to do some of the groundwork for that in the Citadel journals. Despite the fact that the game had moved on significantly from the one that was originally pitched, it was no longer about naval engagements in space. It still retained the original name, and the reason for that was relatively simple.
And the reason we called it Rogue Trader more than anything else was because every time I went to a convention, some youth would come up to me and say, "When's Rogue Trader coming out?" Because we'd advertised this game. It's in one of the original compendiums or journals, because I'd started work on it. So there's an actual advert for that spaceship game in one of these. Because the idea was out there, people would perennially come up to me and say, "When's Rogue Trader coming out?" So we had to, when we launched this science fiction version of Warhammer, it had to be called Rogue Trader because it was the only way of shutting people up.
But then there would be an added complication. A licensing deal that Games Workshop had done for another game would mean that calling this one Rogue Trader might not be quite as simple as initially thought. By then, we had the 2000 AD license for Rogue Trooper, and it was felt that this would be confusing. So we had to call Rogue Trader both Rogue Trader and Warhammer something to avoid confusion, and the something ended up being 40,000. It looked like an awful mouthful at the time. I remember Brian said we'd call it Warhammer 3000 or some such, which wasn't unlike any number of sci-fi games in style. And I said, well, it's set 40,000 years in the future, so we can't really call it Warhammer 3000. So it ended up being Warhammer 40,000, though it settled down to 40k fairly quickly. Although mainly focused on fantasy gaming, Citadel had been producing some science fiction miniatures over the years. typically as part of licensed ranges such as those for Star Trek, Traveller, and Judge Dredd, but there were also some original figures released as well. Early original examples included the Spacefarers range, which accompanied Citadel's earlier failed attempt to crack the sci-fi wargame market, but these had largely fallen by the wayside by the time Rogue Trader rolled around. Though there were some more recent sci-fi Citadel minis that would find themselves making their way into this new Rick Priestley game. Former head of IP at Games Workshop, Alan Merritt, who had worked at Citadel since nearly the beginning, recalled to me some of the early days of Rogue Trader's development.
That's an exciting period. So the process of creating 40k was torturous and only involved a very tiny number of people, because it was never thought it was going to be quite the success it ended up being. The bulk of the early work was Rick Priestley sitting in he may even been at home quite a lot of the time, but in a lonely office, the door locked, just bashing away at keys, grumbling a lot about how narrow the brief was. Because Brian had given him a very specific brief. It must include every model that we have with a gun in our range. Okay, so, well, including all the Doctor Who range. Yes, including them. Whoops. Clever students will find the reference to Daleks in the original 40k book, but it's quite subtle, or maybe not, depending on your investigative powers.
And whilst Priestley was continuing to put together the manuscript for Rogue Trader, there were experiments taking place at Citadel around different types of science fiction miniatures. In the years running up to Rogue Trader's release, there were several science fiction miniatures that would be rebranded into the 40k universe following the game's final publication. Those included the Space Orc and the Piscean Warrior, but perhaps most notable was the LE2 limited edition Imperial Space Marine by Bob Naismith. This was notable not just because it was a pre-Rogue Trader 40k miniature, but because it was the first appearance of the Space Marine design, a design that would be further iterated on by Naismith in a small range of C-100 Imperial Marines the following year. So there were more or less miniatures being released for a game that didn't yet exist, one that had already been advertised as a Starship combat game, which also had its own miniatures. I'm very keen on this little bit of self-reference. On a 1986 mail-order flyer, the C-43 Trader (Rogue). And whilst Rogue Trader miniatures were slowly making their way out into the world, there were other signs and portents too, notably in White Dwarf, such as this one from issue 87's Awesome Lies news column. Warhammer 40k is indeed the long-awaited futuristic version of the Warhammer Fantasy battle system, and shares many of its mechanisms and much of its feel. Warhammer 40k is something of a new approach to future gaming. It's not science fiction, for starters, but pure fantasy, set in the far future. Technology is important, but not the mainstay of civilization. The game is set in a dirty, mean, bloodthirsty universe. And so, 4 years after it was first advertised, Rogue Trader was finally being released. It had changed already from what it was first intended to be, but this first edition of the game would absolutely lay down the foundations of 40k forever. For more than 100 centuries, the Emperor has sat immobile on the golden throne of Earth. He is the master of mankind by the will of the gods, and master of a million worlds by the might of his inexhaustible armies. He is a rotting carcass, writhing invisibly with power from the dark age of technology. He is the carrion lord of the Imperium, to whom 1,000 souls are sacrificed every day, and for whom blood is drunk and flesh eaten. Human blood and human flesh, the stuff of which the Imperium is made. Rick Priestley's writing for Rogue Trader is some of his very best, and in a White Dwarf shortly after the release of the game, he would understandably celebrate the fact that this was his first solo war game. Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader is something of a first for me, the first complete game system that I've done on my own. Now that it's finished and printed, this is also the first game with which I'm completely happy. Well, almost completely. We creative types. Laced throughout the book, there is a deep sense of humour, satirical jibes at contemporary politics and pop culture, and an abundance of absurdist details. Most of it written with Priestley's playfully earnest voice. And at the same time, the setting is more broadly established as a true dystopian nightmare, populated by scumbags, ne'er-do-wells, and of course rogues, who would as quickly betray mankind as fight to save it. The impossibly enormous Imperium is rife with Terry Gilliam-style bureaucratic excess, and the understanding of technology is so long lost as to leave its users believing things work only as a result of divine intervention. The divine, in this case, being the long-dead corpse emperor entombed in his stasis machine known as the Golden Throne, barely clinging to existence thanks to the constant sacrifice of human lives. Priestley has since spoken about the many influences that went into the creation of this world, the books and movies and TV shows and historical references that are scattered throughout it. And if you take a look at all of them, it is an incredible education. Some of the most obvious inspirations are clear. Frank Herbert's Dune can be seen in the technology, scale, and branches of the Imperium. Judge Dredd and his 2000 AD friends, Rogue Trooper, Nemesis the Warlock, can be felt in the look and feel of many characters and organizations. Even Star Wars, a universe with an altogether more optimistic bent, which for the most part told Rick Priestley what not to do, can be found in the art of the game. And these inspirations were no secret. They were worn proudly on the sleeve of the game. If you've ever left the cinema or turned from the TV screen wishing that you could invent your own Death Stars, Stormtroopers, whirring ornithopters, and wild-eyed heroes, then this is for you. Warhammer 40,000 is the game that lets you create all kinds of exciting, futuristic adventure on a tabletop. You will need a few models, a little scenery, and the odd accessory such as dice and a ruler. But most importantly, you will need a smattering of creative genius. The fact that you are reading this is a sure indication that you are eminently qualified on that score. There were a great many individuals involved in the creation of Rogue Trader, and whilst I can't read them all out, I thought that before we get into some of the specific personalities involved, it was worth at least putting the entire credits on screen even briefly. Though it is undoubtedly the creation of Rick Priestley, it is also true that this was a clear team effort, with a cavalcade of wondrously talented individuals contributing in a myriad of ways. Cover art for the book was painted by John Sibbick, the same artist responsible for the incredible covers of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and Warhammer Fantasy Battles 3rd edition. The unforgettable wraparound image depicts a squad of Crimson Fist Space Marines in a desperate last battle against encroaching space orcs. On the back cover, it's even possible to see orc dreadnoughts lumbering out of the fog of war, an original invention of Sibbick's. Sibbick would also provide some of the internal art alongside a roster of around 20 other illustrators, including Tony Ackland, Dave Andrews, John Blanche, Carl Critchlow, Colin Dixon, Angus Fieldhouse, David Gallagher, Jez Goodwin, Tony Huff, Pete Nifton, Martin McKenna, Ali Morrison, Trish Morrison, Bob Naismith, Will Reese, and Stephen Tappin. There really are an incredible number of amazing pieces of art in this game, but I think that my favourite might just be the technical diagram of Space Marine armour by the unreasonably talented Nicholas Coleman, who signed his work as H. Why not let me know in the comments which is your favourite image from the nascent 41st millennium? The art of Rogue Trader gives an incredible sense of the epic brutality, the worn-down grit, the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, and it's rightly remembered for its incredible impact on readers in 1987. But it wasn't the art alone, nor the writing on its own either, that fully immersed readers into this universe. Everyone from Rick Priestley himself to Bob Naismith and many others have cited the incredible graphic design of Rogue Trader as being key to making it such a success. When I spoke to the graphic designer for the game earlier this year, Chaz Elliott, he told me a little bit about his process for creating it.
It was primarily redressing or reapproaching what a wargame book should be in terms of making it easy to use. So it was much more of an information presentation from a graphical interface perspective than it was necessarily just let's make a great looking book. It had a dual use of ensuring that if a consumer picked it up and wanted to play the game, then the immersion process of reading from page 1 through to the basic rules through whatever was sequenced, structured, and understandable, clear, and encapsulated what we felt was the this sort of like the grimdark aspect of the world setting and the environment. We were lucky to have probably an illustration budget and an illustration layout amount that preceded a lot of the books that you see now, where there has to be a certain illustration density, there has to be a certain, you can't have page and page of text. There has to be. It's much more of a hybrid of a graphic novel, of a allowing the consumer to immerse themselves into that world setting, into that environment, making sure that there's a photo showing a game in play, making sure that there's photo illustrating an example, so that you never fundamentally forget that its engine was to drive miniature cells, but at the same token, it was also to engage and to actively draw people into this new and wonderful grim setting.
As Elliot mentions, the format of the book features a wealth of art generously integrated into the text, from full-page spreads to inserts to spot illustrations. Every page helps to create a vision of what the 41st millennium is all about, and the typesetting and text layout all add to an organic flow that makes it easier to read and to understand. The rules sections of the book were split into several key chapters. Combat, which covered warfare in the distant future. Equipment, which covered the technology of conflict, and the advanced gamer, which included optional rules and different takes to enhance your game. The core rules for the game were based on those seen in Warhammer Fantasy battles, with the still familiar stat line, along with now excised characteristics like intelligence, cool, and willpower. The I go, you go turn sequencing was entrenched from the start, and modifications to unit coherency had been necessary to make squad-based skirmishing movement possible with the Fantasy Battles unit rules. There were also changes to how ranged weaponry worked to make it more meaningful in this futuristic setting. Vehicle rules were developed based on Priestley's own work for the Judge Dredd role-playing game, and he borrowed the critical hit chart from Woofrup to manage damage against vehicles more effectively. As with Fantasy, there was still the expectation that the game would feature an independent games master. The rules were largely cross-compatible with Warhammer Fantasy, which meant that if you wanted to, for some reason, you could fight a battle between Space Marines and Goblin Spearmen, and the only challenges you'd face would be ethical ones. Although the rules writing had predominantly been done by Rick Priestley on his own, when the game had entered playtesting, more people had become involved. In an interview for the Talking Miniatures book, Alan and Michael Perry remembered one of their early playtests. We went over to playtest 40k at Brian's, and I remember that he didn't have any scenery. So he went off to the kitchen cupboard and started taking out all these tins of baked beans and other cans. Then he ripped all the labels off and started placing them on the table to use as cover. And Diane, Brian Ansell's wife, was just standing there going, "What on earth are you doing? How will we know what's what?" In the end, there were about 20 different cans on the table. Yeah. And so for the next couple of weeks, I think they probably had a few very unusual meals. I guess no one had invented the alien cactus yet. One aspect of the advanced rules that I absolutely love is the inclusion of random plot generators for scenarios. There are 10 random plot tables that feature a total of 100 wild and incredible story hooks, with a further table available to add extra complications. Several of these feature a recurring and infamous character called Abdul Goldberg, a dastardly double-dealing rogue trader with schemes the universe over. It's also in these tables that we finally get to see the long-promised psycho circus of Dr. Castallo, whose psychic clowns, dangerous mutants, and weird aliens have become caught up in someone else's battle. The section actually ends with an invitation for players to submit their own humdinging plots for inclusion in future tables, and there is no closing date for that invitation. So I suggest that we should all send in a ton of plots and get them included in the latest edition of the game. The plot generators add some wonderful grit to the world of 40k, but the actual setting was already laid in stone, elsewhere in the book in a section called The Age of the Imperium. The background material presented in this section of the book has been evolved during the author's games and campaigns over several years. In that time, many of the races, their worlds, civilizations, and attitudes have been worked out in considerable detail. It is for you, as games masters and players, to use this information as you see fit. The Imperium is so vast that it is constantly at war with enemies both without and within. alien races, political rebels, pirates, and renegades all require the attention of the Imperium's military might. Institutions like the priesthood of the Adeptus Terra, the Custodes, the Mechanicum, Inquisition, and the Astronomicon all serve a purpose in this unwieldy empire. And though warp storms, uprising, and Xenos incursions all pose a threat, the Emperor of Mankind has a great many tools with which to fight them. And though the universe of 40k is established in great detail, there is still the opportunity given for players to create their own aspects of this world. There is nothing to prevent you from expanding or altering the material given. In some cases, this will be necessary for you to derive the full benefit from the background. Within the guidelines given, you will be able to devise your own worlds, placing the stamp of your imagination upon the game. There are a great many names, references, places, characters that are established in this edition of the game that are still essential components of the world of 40k even today. Hell's Reach, Badab, the Eye of Terror, they are all present, but they're quite different. Perhaps the greatest example of this are the Space Marines. Ever the bedrock on which the game is built and sold, their armour may look mostly the same, but underneath, they are barely recognisable. The Legiones Astartes, the Space Marines, are given centre stage as the most powerful and feared of the Imperium's fighting troops. There are details about the recruitment processes for new Marines, some of which might feel familiar, like the fact that the best hunters from feral worlds are brought into the Imperium. But then there is an altogether different type of fighter from more industrial planets that is approached in a quite different way. For true aggression and psychotic killer instinct, however, few recruits can best the murderous followers of the city scum that roam the darkest pits of the Hive worlds. Driven to the extremes of insanity by the colossal pressures of Hive world living, these merciless killers are usually ignored by the authorities. They make ideal Space Marines, and whole gangs of city scum are sometimes hunted and captured for this purpose. Knowing that these guys are out there keeping the galaxy safe, well, that makes me feel all warm and fuzzy. Space Marine recruits would then undergo extreme medical procedures to make them stronger, more dangerous, and theoretically more controllable. And that's when they would then find themselves in one of 1,000 Space Marine chapters, each one 1,000 warriors strong. Every chapter had its own organisation, its rituals, its colour schemes, and whilst there is no mention of Primarchs or Gene Seeds, you would find references to the likes of the Blood Angels, Space Wolves, Dark Angels, and Ultramarines. Plus, in the best of all worlds, they could even be equipped with shuriken catapults if you wanted. Some things remain ever the same though. In more than one place, the motto of the Marines makes an appearance. Even in 1987, they shall know no fear. Though the Imperium were undoubtedly presented as the stars of the show, it was also clear that they needed some enemies to fight, and there were a couple of contenders. Not really an enemy, but certainly an oddity, Homo sapiens rotundus were an evolution of mankind resulting from the effects of high-gravity outer space living. More commonly known as squats, these taciturn and tough fighters were amongst the few abhumans regularly accepted into the higher ranks of the Imperium. The space elves known as the Eldar operate from enormous craft worlds and carry out pirate raids, merchant missions, and Star Treks for their own inexplicably alien reasons. The orcs and goblins of fantasy also found themselves transposed into this far future as well, with the savage race known as the orcs and their underling slave race of Gretchins representing the principal enemies of the Imperium. Brutal, aggressive, and thoroughly unmanageable, the orcs of 40k were an incorrigible menace from the very start. And in the bestiary section of the book, there were other races and creatures that would go on to be major players in the galactic conflicts to come. The Tyranids are already present, explained as a truly alien threat equipped with biological weaponry and travelling the galaxy on at least 13 hive fleets. Their origins are unknown, and they are said to act like cosmic locusts, mercilessly devouring all life that they encounter. And there are also gene stealers. Ripped almost directly from the movie screen, they are described as an alien that lays eggs in a host body. There is no mention of gene stealer cults or their relationship with the Tyranids. though it wouldn't be too long before Space Hulk would make them far more recognisable. Creatures and curios like the Zotes and the Amble have since been dropped out and returned to the 41st millennium, despite their unusual origin stories. Alas, space vampires and space zombies didn't seem to have quite as much life in them. Perhaps the greatest divergence from the 40k universe that we would recognise in modern times is the near total absence of chaos in the Rogue Trader book. There is no mention of the Horus Heresy, no traitor legions are detailed, no accounting of the Chaos Gods themselves, but there were a couple of mentions and hints here and there. Warp entities are described in the bestiary, and whilst they aren't specifically named Chaos Demons, there is plenty of talk of psychers falling prey to malevolent, bodiless creatures that possess and corrupt them. There's even a specific reference to demonic possession in the book later on. There is talk of unspecified yet prescribed cults, and though they seem more often more politically motivated than by service to the ruinous powers, there were even human renegade marines pictured in the book. Rick Priestley has said that the 40k universe that emerged from his own writing and his games didn't include chaos originally, that was an invention and an obsession of Brian Ansell because of his love for Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion. That would be why the Realm of Chaos would later arrive and introduce chaos as a substantial force in the Warhammer 40,000 and Warhammer Fantasy universes. But despite that, it was clear even from before the game came out that chaos would be present, that it would be something that would eventually infiltrate and change the 41st millennium. Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40k share the same universe. The Slann, as Warhammer players will already know, are extraterrestrials anyway, and as for the place of chaos, all will be revealed. This was of course a reference to the impending arrival of 1988's Realm of Chaos, Slaves to Darkness, a book of background and rules that would be compatible with Warhammer Fantasy Battles, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and Warhammer 40,000, and which was the culmination of Ansell's belief in the power of chaos as a boon to the Warhammer worlds, a belief that has since been roundly vindicated. With White Dwarf issue 93, there was an enormous fanfare to celebrate the release of Rogue Trader. It was a huge success, and former Citadel design studio manager Richard Ellard reflected on that original release in Talking Miniatures. On one hand, it felt like the business just exploded, but on the other, it was just business as usual. We were just getting on with the next thing, the next book or game we were supposed to be working on. We were not at the sharp end of sales. Alan Merritt and I shared a flat at the time, and I seem to remember we invited the whole studio to a 40k is finished party at our house. But the following Monday, we were all back to work, and Alan Merritt reflected on the impact of that release as well.
When 40k actually hit the streets, it was probably the first time that we nearly broke the company through success rather than through failure. So, because it was insane. It was bonkers. Everything sold out. We had immense pressure. Suddenly landed back onto the studio. So, you've done a fantastic thing. Now you've all got to work 12-hour shifts to get enough new 40k product out to satisfy this monster you've created. So the result wasn't that putting our feet up and lighting up a cigar and enjoying ourselves. It was hard work. Suddenly we had to do like real work. It's like, oh no, we've got to get another supplement out. And then Brian was banging on about army lists. We need army lists and where are all the 40k models? What are you playing at, Merritt? Where's the range? And so we were making models hand over fist, and everybody was getting involved. And Brian was telling the designers to make this model, and he was coming into the studio and saying, "No, I told Bob Mason to make these, and I told Ali to make those." And I have to go around and check that they knew what they were doing.
The initial plan at Citadel wasn't to invest a huge amount in new models for Rogue Trader. Instead, there was an expectation that you would be able to convert your fantasy models to play in the sci-fi game. To support that, there were going to be weapons packs, which would let you take an orc with a sword or an axe or a shield, chop those off, and replace it with a blaster or a bolter. However, excitement in the design studio and the changing technologies that were available to plastic manufacturer would see things go in a different direction. Citadel had been advancing its plastic miniature manufacturing capability, having brought in John Thornthwaite from Matchbox to head up the project, and after early attempts with the psychostyrene dwarves, drastic plastic orcs, and the larger scale fighting fantasy miniatures, it was finally possible to deliver on Brian Ansell's exacting standards. For Warhammer, this meant that the Skeleton Horde box, dubbed PBS-1, would be the first box of modern plastic Citadel miniatures. These were followed by a box of Daleks and Cybermen for Doctor Who, and then later there would be the well-regarded Warhammer Fantasy Regiment. But for Rogue Trader, there would be an even more famous, undeniably more popular release, RTB-01, the Imperial Space Marines. In Talking Miniatures, former Citadel sculptor and designer of the first Imperial Space Marine, Bob Naismith, recalled how that first box of Space Marines came about. We wanted to make a boxed set of Space Marines. We knew Warhammer 40,000 was coming out, and we wanted to have all the sculptors working on it, as many as possible anyway. In the end, it was essentially myself, Ali Morrison, Jez Goodwin, and the twins Alan and Michael Perry, I think it was. And as I remember, we kind of all sat around a table and sculpted them together. One of us would do a bit on a model, and then pass it on. And there would be a lot more 40k models over the next few years. Whether it was the RTB-02 Metal Space Orcs by Kev Adams, the Many Amazing Space Elves by Jez Goodwin, Nick Bibby's Zoats, Bob Ollie's Space Pirates, or Ali Morrison's Imperial Army, who were all given rock musician names by Tim Pollard. In another interview from Talking Miniatures, former Citadel and Marauder sculptor Trish Carden recalled the energy in the design studio around the time of Rogue Trader's release. Rogue Trader had been released and had taken the world by storm. As a result, the whole design team was pretty much focused on getting the miniatures done for 40k, you know? The Orcs, the Eldar, the Squats, and of course, endless Space Marines, with all their different chapters. That was where Citadel was throwing its weight and energy at the time. It wasn't that fantasy was forgotten about, but it was certainly second in line to 40k. As you would expect, the launch of 40k was artfully and generously supported in the pages of White Dwarf. In issue 92, shortly before the game went on sale, the inside cover had featured a full-page spread dedicated to teasing the game. On it, you could see a Space Marine that had been cropped at the knees in just such a way that he looks almost like a cute chibi illustration. And then, in September 1987, with White Dwarf issue 93, the stars aligned, the warp gates opened, and the fate of mankind changed forever. Rogue Trader had arrived. From here on out, there would be a regular procession of new 40k content in White Dwarf, with background, miniatures, heavy metal, conversion guides, painting guides, terrain guides, scenarios, and everything else that you could imagine. Land Raider variants and Harlequins, Ogrins and Grey Knights, Squat Lore and Christmas Space Marines. There was something for everyone. Chapter-approved rules would expand and evolve the game further, and with major new supplements like the Realm of Chaos books, and crossover products that were compatible with Warhammer Fantasy and Judge Dredd, there would be 6 years of incredible growth on the cards for 40k. In fact, there would be so much cool stuff that I'm going to be doing a video just about the Rogue Trader supplements, so keep an eye on the channel for that. Although it had taken a phenomenal amount of work and an unreal amount of creative energy, the release of Rogue Trader was just the beginning for 40k. This game, this book, literally changed the fate of Games Workshop, Citadel Miniatures, and the hobby lives of countless wargamers. Warhammer Fantasy may have built the launchpad for Games Workshop's miniature wargaming, but Warhammer 40,000 was the rocket that took it into the stratosphere, and the booster rockets of the Rogue Trader name, well, they quickly fell away, but what we were left with was 40k. Looking back, we can see just how much of what we know and love about 40k really does have its roots in that origin. That first book, Rogue Trader, created so much. Sure, things would be added later that would completely redefine the setting in many ways. The Horus Heresy, everybody's favourite Xenos, the Tau. But for real, this was the very beginning of 40k, and there is so much in it that is still there today. It is a remarkable achievement. On pages 260 and 261 of the original Rogue Trader book, there is a fantastic piece of artwork that depicts many of the talented creators involved in making the game happen. Illustrated by Martin McKenna, the spread includes everyone from Rick Priestley to Brian Ansell to Jervis Johnson to the Perry twins and John Blanche. On the nurgle.stelio site that I've linked in the description below, there is a version of this image that you can click on and see the names of all of the staff who are illustrated. Very much worth checking out. And here is one final example of just how apt the original Rogue Trader was for the version of 40k that still lives to this day. Its very first opening lines were these. To be a man in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. This is the tale of these times. It is a universe you can live today if you dare, for this is a dark and terrible era where you will find little comfort or hope. If you want to take part in the adventure, then prepare yourself now. Forget the power of technology, science, and common humanity. Forget the promise of progress and understanding. For there is no peace amongst the stars, only an eternity of carnage and slaughter and the laughter of thirsting gods. But the universe is a big place, and whatever happens, you will not be missed. There is always a danger when making a video like this that looks back with hindsight at the steps it took to create something as mammoth and game-changing as 40k Rogue Trader, that you can start to make things seem inevitable. That the steps were simple, that it was obvious what would happen, that someone was bound to create Rogue Trader, an impossibly successful science fiction wargame, when one hadn't been created before. But of course, that's rarely the case. The reality is, we can't ever know for sure what would have happened if Rick Priestley hadn't been freakishly creative and yearning to explore a science fantasy universe. What might have occurred if Brian Ansell hadn't been there to shepherd Priestley and Hal in their earliest creations, and given them a platform to publish their most magnificent games? If Bob Naismith hadn't designed the Imperial Space Marines? If Chaz Elliott hadn't caught the reader's eye and guided them through compelling and dynamic pages? If John Sibbick's cover hadn't instantly immersed everyone in the fates and fears of a cadre of damned Crimson Fists? There were probably 1,000 times 1,000 decisions made in order for this game to have been created in the way that it was, and for it to have been successful, and for us to be talking about it even today, 40 years later. It's very easy to boil that down into a handful of key moments, a handful of key decisions, a handful of key people. And whilst this was absolutely the work of Rick Priestley, I have only scratched the surface in the decisions, the talents, and the individuals who all contributed to making this game possible.
I was very lucky to be the right person in the right place at the right time. And none of this would have happened without Brian Ansell and his vision of what a toy soldier industry, fantasy toy soldiers could be. None of it would happen without Brian. And none of it, I don't know if Warhammer would have been Warhammer without Hal. You know, if I had a talent, it was for seeing a good somebody else's good idea and making it better, or making it work, or fulfilling it. I think Brian would say, not quite fulfilling it, but good effort, right? Because nothing was ever perfect. He was a perfectionist. And that was what drove him, and it's what drove all of us in the end. You know, we all wanted to do right. We wanted to do good stuff.
I hope that you have enjoyed this look at the origins and the making of Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader. As I say, I have barely scratched the surface of this incredible story. So let me know if you would like to see me tackle more aspects of Rogue Trader and the wider 40k series. I think that there's a lot of interesting stories to tell. I would like to thank Alan Merritt, Chaz Elliott, and of course Rick Priestley for all of the incredible work they did to create this game, and for agreeing to talk to me about it. And I would also like to thank Robin Dews and John Stallard for creating the Talking Miniatures book. I've referred to it many times in the creation of this video because it is an awesome resource about the history of Games Workshop. I thoroughly recommend it, and I've included a link in the description to it below. You will also find down in the description below a link to my Patreon, which, if you are interested in supporting the work I do here on the channel, I would love for you to go and check out. It's enormously helpful, and I really appreciate your support. Of course, if you are able to like and subscribe and share this video and others on the channel, that is an enormous help too, and I'm very, very grateful for it. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. This book is genuinely amazing, and I'm very glad that I was able to do a video about it. But this is not the edition that I grew up with. No, that one was even more amazing. So hopefully I will be able to take a look at that one day.